ActionFigureResource.com. Yesterday's toys, today's treasures.
Articulation is quite simply how many parts of an action figure's body move. We'll start by explaining the most simple, straightforward form, namely the mushroom joint, also known as a peg, swivel or cut joint. This is so named because of a mushroom-shaped peg that inserts into a hole and allows for movement in a circular direction around the peg. The mushroom cap at the end preventing the separation of the two body parts. This type of joint allows for 360 degrees of motion, much like the hands of a clock face. In today's market it is most often found at the figure's waist or wrists, but originally was far more prevalent across the bodies of every figure. To an outsider, the natural expectation would be that action figures, being exemplary of technology like everything else that evolves, would start off immensely simple and become more complex as time went on. If we're going to count the very first statues and effigies of humanoid figures whittled from bits of wood as the first instances, then yes, they started out with 0 points of articulation. However, there is one toy that is largely regarded as the first action figure, and that was G.I. Joe, America's movable fighting man, released in 1964 by Hasbro. Now this guy boasted 21 points of articulation, but he actually had 19. Either way, it's a stunning amount to be in possession of straight out of the gate, and shares many similarities with posable artists' mannequins, the design of which date back centuries. The articulation points were located in the following places: neck, shoulders, biceps, elbows, wrists, torsos, hips, thighs, knees, and ankles. The figure was held together by means of elastic wire hooks and metal rivets. Pivot pins were made of a ribbed plastic which was pressed into the adjacent limb section, allowing the limbs to rotate as well as hinge at the pivot point. This specific method of attaching the appendages was patented as a connection for use in toy figures. The hip balls were made of softer vinyl that allowed movement while retaining the surface friction required to maintain a pose. This level of attention to detail was of course costly to manufacture and had caused product development no end of grief to devise, as simple as the end result seemed. The fact that so many still exist intact after 50 years is a testament to the production quality that Hasbro demanded of its manufacturing plants. As you can see, this was a high bar of both quality and variety of articulation to begin with. Within 8 years, in 1972, the world's greatest superheroes line by Mego took this essential model and simplified it for cheaper production. These figures had a turning head, ball-jointed shoulders, elbows, wrists, ball-jointed waist, ball-jointed pelvis, knees, and in some cases when they weren't wearing large boots, their ankles also moved. The essential difference between a regular mushroom joint and a ball joint is that rather than the two surfaces simply lying flush with one another, a ball joint allows the limb to extend out and be rotated in various directions. It usually contains a hinge running inside a ball that connects to the torso, pelvis, or bicep. One more modern variation is a ball and socket joint, which is a ball literally plugged into a socket with no hinges inside. In 1977, Kenner put out the Star Wars line. These were immensely popular and cheap to produce, with 93 figures eventually released, emphasizing collectability over complexity. To that end, they each had a mere 5 points of articulation: neck, shoulders, and pelvis. In fact, some without posable heads only had 4 points. The extreme popularity of the Star Wars line sent out the message to toy manufacturers that kids wanted the characters they loved from the screen and would forsake expensive hinges and ball joints in favour of the collectability of small scale and massive range. This was a major influence on the following decade of the 1980s. In 1982, G.I. Joe re-emerged as the real American hero line by Hasbro. These now had the scale of Star Wars, along with the array of colourful goodies and baddies to collect, but boasted ball-jointed shoulders, elbows, waist, ball-jointed thighs, and hinged knees, making them significantly more posable and conducive to dynamic play than Star Wars. They were also released in a multimedia blitz of the TV show and comic, which cemented the characters in the minds of the kids, a marketing model that is still one of the most effective to this day. 2 years later, in 1984, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe were released by Mattel. These were deliberately sculpted to be stylized and cartoonishly muscular when held against the relative realism of the Star Wars and G.I. Joe line. The heads were hollow rubber, much like Mego, as opposed to the solid plastic of Star Wars and Joe. He-Man had a swivel neck, shoulders, and ball-jointed thighs attached internally to a rubber-sprung battle-action waist. This turned out to be a key orchestrated feature of this figure line. This spring-loaded feature enables He-Man to power punch and throw weapons and other objects such as small, puny Star Wars and G.I. Joe figures. When Roger Sweet was originating the He-Man concept, he reached a point where he had conceived a tremendously physically powerful male action figure in a dynamic and imposing battle-action stance. But based on his past Mattel toy experience, Sweet knew that the figure's strong action appearance was not enough to sell the He-Man concept to Mattel upper management. The figure also needed a strong, direct yet simple action feature, so Sweet originated the idea that a spring-loaded, swivel-waist power punch and weapon swing would be the terrific action needed, and this single feature would be added to the entire line of male action figures. Significantly not the females, though. That same year, LJN released the Thundercats line in a considerably larger scale, with a mere 5 points of articulation, neck, shoulders and thighs, same as Star Wars, only with a complicated lever-action fist-pounding mechanism located inside their hollowed-out and oversized torsos. The size and action features made individual figure manufacture costs relatively high, which kept the assortment sparse to balance. As a result, there were only around 37 figures produced over 3 series, going against the grain of the quantities offered by Hasbro, Kenner and Mattel. Thundercats were less popular, and possibly as a result of their less aggressive and enterprising marketing strategies, LJN folded in 1995. In 1988, a little-known company called Playmates launched the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles line. Again, the articulation was simplistic in nature, with neck, shoulders and ball-jointed thighs. They also had neat swivel elbows which allowed for some cool ninja weapon brandishing poses. Again, the focus was on cross-media marketing coupled with quantity and collectability. And like Joe and He-Man, long after the initial fad had died down, they were a notable show and toy line for re-release at least once per decade since. Some lines which followed this pattern, like Star Wars and Transformers, now enjoy near permanent fixture on toy shelves. So while articulation is important, especially to some collectors, it is not what sells figures initially, nor what keeps the lines going. The History of Articulation, a case study for ActionFigureResource. Part 2.
ActionFigureResource.com.
In 1994, Todd McFarlane launched the Spawn toy line, tying in with the comics and later animated show and movie. Series 1 Spawn had simple neck, shoulder, thigh and knee articulation, and this feature swiftly dropped lower and lower down the list of the increasingly popular teen and adult collector-focused media circus that McFarlane Productions became. In the meantime, kid-focused toy lines in the 90s were largely doing much the same as they had in the 80s, but with less immense and breakout success. Toy Biz ruled the roost with their X-Men, Spider-Man and other Marvel properties, again with movable neck, shoulders, elbows, waists, thighs and knees. Once again, focus was on quantity. By the year 2000, Spawn had hit Series 17, and by this time Spawn 5 had precisely 0 points of articulation, sacrificing this play-related aspect of action figures for extreme detail, effectively bringing the action figure evolution full circle and generating a collector fascination with mini statues. McFarlane Toys pressed on with the statue angle, and it was customary for most of their figures to have one movable limb, usually its gun arm. This allowed them to crystallize in plastic striking comic artwork, movie and video game characters, and of course sporting heroes, the collectors of which are usually adult and less concerned with play features. In the years since then, the high-end market has focused on capturing that detail but incorporating the articulation, durability and accessories of G.I. Joe that statue toys tend to lack, slowly evolving and combining the two tangential disciplines of action figure design. A significant line for both exceptionally sculpted detail coupled with some of the most extensive articulation yet, with not only no reduction in overall figure form but greatly increased dynamic style, was the 2001 Street Fighter line by Sota. These had removable and alternating ball and socket heads, ball-jointed shoulders, swivel biceps, elbows, removable hands, hinged wrists, ball-jointed trunks, ball-jointed thighs, double-jointed knees, swivel ankles, hinged feet and toes. A hinged joint in this case is a classic element of articulation dating back to the original Joe and before, in which two prongs or holes are fastened around an anchor or another limb. This allows for forward and back or side to side movements, and they are usually found on elbows and knees. One of the best aspects of the Street Fighter line, even after all of the above, was how effectively they held their stance. Since they were based on a fighting video game, every character had to look like they were frozen in time with the game on pause, ergo the limbs were tight and held poses with confidence, and with a weighty, high-quality plastic, they were exceptionally well balanced. In 2002, stemming from Spider-Man Classics, Toy Biz released a line that became the industry standard for 6-inch collector-focused action figures, namely Marvel Legends. Being based on a blanket Marvel license, there was a virtually limitless array of characters to render in plastic. These typically boasted a ball-jointed head, ball-jointed shoulders, swivel biceps, double-jointed elbows, swivel forearms, hinged and swivel wrists, hinged fingers, ball-jointed trunk, ball-jointed pelvis, swivel thighs, double-jointed knees, swivel ankles, hinged feet and toes. Many figures also featured integral hinges at the shoulders surrounding the ball joints to allow the arms more flexibility and the ability to cross over. This focus on superposability, coupled with the immense popularity of the line among both kids and adults, made it a major influence in the years that followed. Mattel's DC Universe Classics were one of those most obviously following up on this success, and utilized the H-joint, in which the hips are designed so as to move with the range of a ball joint against the trunk. The parts are all flushed against one another to minimize the joint's interference with the sculpt. This is thus a sort of combination mushroom and hinge joint. Another variation is the dumbbell joint, an articulation point in which a ball or knob sits in a socket with a peg extending from the ball to another ball or knob, which then attaches to the limb. This allows for ball joint-like movement, but not quite as much of a range of motion. It is often an easy way of getting simple pelvis to thigh movement, and is popular among customization fans. Stickfur's model kits from Singapore deserve a mention for their elegant simplicity, exemplifying a fluidity of movement that is hard to match. These harken back to the artist mannequins I mentioned at the beginning, and utilize the same customizable lack of identity. And special mention must go to Revoltech by Kyoto, originally released in 2006. This series usually comprises of anime and video game characters popular in Japan, and what they lack in size, being a fairly diminutive 4 inches high, they more than make up for with accessories and articulation. Revoltech is a portmanteau for revolver technology, in reference to the unique revolver joint system which all of the figures in this particular series utilize. This gives the figure a wide range of motion and stability, allowing for many dynamic and varied poses. The revolver joint is composed of 3 pieces, 2 half spheres whose flat sections provide the friction surface for the articulation, and a cross-section pin that locks the whole assembly into place. Both half spheres have round, cylindrical pegs used to connect the different parts to any given figure. They click as they are cycled round and hold themselves firmly in place once a pose is selected. Star Wars had re-emerged in the mid-90s with a Power of the Force 2 line, recapturing the simple 5-point early articulation with added waist movement. In the 2 decades since, hundreds of figures over dozens of lines have been released, over time adding more and more articulation as they emerged. The Vintage Original Trilogy collection re-rendered some of the most beloved of the original 93, with that count upgraded to 10 points of articulation. The more recent Star Wars Black line adds to these and expands the figures to 6 inches. Adhering to today's standards, the designers at Hasbro endeavoured to hide and conceal the lines of hinges within the sculpt of the figure, actually making them seem less like toys, or less like our perception of toys. This appears to be the direction articulation is moving in. More points, better concealed, leaving us with movable statues, the better to near perfectly combine the functional with the aesthetic. Never better exemplified than in the luxury collector-focused range of Hot Toys, straddling the line between plaything and art. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I've been Alex Shaw. Let us know in the comments what else you'd like to see us cover on Action Figure Resource.
ActionFigureResource.com. Yesterday's toys, today's treasures.